Hello! Sorry I didn't make a video yesterday. I meant to make this video yesterday, but a young 26-year-old punk hit my truck with his BMW SUV. Kind of messed up his bumper really bad. You know what it did to my truck? It did absolutely nothing. It just smeared some of the white lettering on the sidewall of the tire. It didn't scuff the rim or any part of the actual car. It's like 1 in a million. It was totally his fault, by the way. I'm sure you wanted to know the answer to that. So sometimes I genuinely do. Actually, every time I have a genuine excuse for why I didn't make a video yesterday. So I apologize for that. You can blame a 26-year-old punk for striking my vehicle. First thing he said was regarding the BMW he was driving. A really nice white BMW. He said, this isn't my car. He's driving somebody else's Beamer. I need to talk about something a lot of people like to talk about. I like to do it rationally, logically, using retroduction, Platonic logic, and that's time travel. Yeah, and also to spacecraft. If anybody ever think about this for 5 seconds in the logical mind, they know, of course, spacecraft is nothing, really science fiction-y. Yeah, no, that's not really a word. Explosion tech, which is what we have currently, liquid oxygen, benzene, kerosene, solid rocket, but all of this is tech based upon forces, chemical conversion. It's basically chemistry. Most of it is chemistry. So we have to, of course, go into field propulsion tech. Any entity on some other world more advanced than us, of course, would have field propulsion tech. So let's talk about time travel and vectored travel regarding field propulsion tech. And you'll find this actually be rather rational, actually extremely rational and logical. There's a lot of reports of these. Of course, they don't have to be actually saucer shaped. And I'd like to show you something over here. It's pyramidal shape. And of course, a pyramidal is a more acute angle than an actual dome-shaped, but a lot of these saucer-shaped craft partake of something due to the nature of field propulsion. Also, too, this is exactly the same thing as time. Time is not a thing, and shadow is not a thing. A shadow is, of course, an absence of light. Time is a measure. Time is no different than saying the word quantum, and of course, there's nothing in nature that's quantum. That is a reference to Das Lichtquant. Believe it or not, the bald, tattooed monkey that you're watching in this video actually knows absolutely everything about the history and the origins of the term quantum. Every ancient culture said time was the number 4. 4, of course, is not present in the Fibonacci sequence. That's ancient metaphysics thereof. But time is not a thing. It's a measure, and a measure is not a thing. Doesn't matter if it's an inch, a mile, a foot, a pound, a yard, a meter. These are not things. These are agreed upon standards. So time doesn't exist ultimately. It does exist conventionally, and of course it exists to us conventional beings. But then, of course, we have to ask the question, what is time, since it is a measure? A lot of people actually think it is a support for relativity because GPS satellites actually have temporal correction because they're moving so fast relative to the ground. This is called GPS time dilation. Which is negative. It happens because of the orbiting satellites is moving relatively much faster than the ground receivers. And I forget how many decimal points it goes out into microseconds. There's a specific type of like one billionth of a second. I forget the exact measure of that, but it goes out to a really radical degree. And to actually know your exact latitude and longitude on professional measuring equipment, right literally down to the centimeter. My buddy actually has super expensive GPS equipment for that. It sits there and measures and calculates and measures over and over again, and it'll get you right down to within, like, it'll tell you the accuracy, like 3 millimeters, 5 millimeters, which is really, really astounding. This, of course, is due to redshift. I have made 1,000 videos, and you can watch them, where I actually show redshift and blue shift on any magnet underneath the supercell. You can actually see that the North Pole is rarefied, and the South Pole is compressed, and so you actually have a temporal dilation on each and every magnet, and that proportionality is a ratio of 1 to phi. If it is nominal, you can actually change that by squeezing the time relative to the magnetic field and the geometry. I've actually shown this, and a saucer shape is nothing other than a super dull and less acute pyramidal shape. This is actually palpable. This is made by trying to keep it away from my computer here. A pyramidal shaped magnet, and this is ordered and made only by my magnet buddy called George Mizell. He's Super Magnet Man on YouTube. And it's actually palpably measured. You can take a Gauss meter here right at the tip, and it'll measure on these particular ones, it'll measure just underneath a Tesla of Gaussian flux. A fireman's nozzle is shaped like a pyramid. What it does is it takes super high pressure and it makes it even much higher pressure, boosting it up by actually taking all the volume of water that's coming through the hose and through the base of the nozzle and compressing it right here. We're talking about space compression and time compression and time dilation. I'm getting into time travel here very quickly. But anyway, this is measurable. It's very high flux right here. I don't know if you want to know what a Gauss meter probe is. I've always wanted a Gauss meter probe, but had access to a few for a long time. That's the only reason why I didn't buy one. So you actually have a magnetic flux that's extremely high right here and low here at the base. And if you actually take even magnetic viewing film and put it on the side here, you can see the polaric shift is way up here. So you actually have a greater compression and a greater rarefaction. You can actually order this with tip being north or tip being south. The most astounding features is when you order these with the tip being south, because not only is it compressed on the South Pole, it is even more so compressed. No different than a fireman's nozzle. And there's a reason why these craft, most of which are saucer-shaped, and they don't actually have to be saucer-shaped, but I'm getting that to the second. The beings have to be, whatever beings are traveling, have to be closest to the tip of travel, on the vector travel. This is the reason why spacecrafts are saucer-shaped. Let me show you a little. I love this old Little House on the Prairie kind of mid-1800s chalkboard here. You actually have, I didn't draw the egg shape perfectly here, but you actually have a volume of time, temporal compression, and rarefaction on the north on a regular magnet, proportionality of phi to 1. I can immediately tell underneath the supercell, anybody can, that the South Pole is shifted towards the blue, i.e. temporal compression, and the North Pole is shifted towards the red. You can see immediately, so, well, this side looks more red, that side, well, that's the North Pole over there because it's red shifted. Over here it's blue shifted. So you actually have this phase disparity of geomagnetic precession, where the geomagnetic precession of the centrifugal force vector can't keep up. This is actually really simple. I know I'm like making it sound complicated, but it's actually not. And when these craft are actually traveling extremely fast, there's the best analogy I could come up with is if this is the surface of the water here and you actually have two beings trying to travel to a certain point in time. This, of course, would be shallow waters. This, of course, would be deep water. You actually have dilation and more exposure to time, even though both are arriving at the same time. The person at greater depth is expressed to a greater exposure to time, so they will arrive, and even the folks of relativity and special relativity will admit this, but they think it's warping of space-time. It's not. It's actually time dilation due to field rarefaction and compression. Very simple. You don't actually have to reify, meaning prop up something. It's like propping up and talking people, warning them about dragons. Like, well, dragons don't exist. That's what relativity and special relativity actually does. It reifies space and time as things themselves that act upon things, but they don't. The actual field itself does that. They also, too, use time dilation and GPS satellite correction for their belief that that supports relativity. It actually doesn't. Dr. Oleg D. Jefamenko with 2 PhDs said exactly what it was, which is called electromagnetic retardation. That's literally what it's called. You go look that up, where you actually have rarefaction and compression on a super fast-moving object. But the things that we call super fast-moving objects, like the GPS satellites, are not that fast. But what if, and this is the reason why these craft are mostly saucer-shaped, but they don't have to be. You just have to travel at the tip of them. Why are they saucer-shaped? It's the same reason that if I were to accelerate the craft here, you can actually see I have a parabola up here. You'd actually have to be at the tip for the greatest, the least amount of exposure to time at the tip of the craft. In other words, it'd be a wake front. If you actually rarefy time at the tip of the volume of the craft that you're traveling in, then it's actually going to be compressed back here, and it's going to be greater and greater compression. The same is true of magnetic flux on this pyramid magnet. The same is true of a fireman's nozzle, which is conical. It's actually an elongated pyramidal shape. You remember when they started creating a faster than sound craft? You ever seen The Right Stuff? It's about early space flight and also, too, trying to break the sound barrier. They kept having issues and issues, and the craft had wings that were perfectly straight, well, nearly perfectly straight. They still had an airfoil on them, but they were straight out perpendicular to the craft, to the vector of travel. What happens is the faster the craft approached the sound barrier, the actual wake front of sound bended around the, not literally bent, but bent around the tip of the craft, so you actually created this wake front around the craft, and it would impact the wings, which were perpendicular to the craft. And they found out, and that's the reason why all modern fighter craft look basically like a triangle. When the actual wake front gets compressed, the faster and the faster you go, and that, of course, is the sound barrier. The same is true of time. Time is only a measure of magnitudes. This is the reason why they figured out to break the sound barrier, because the craft kept wanting to shake apart. And that's because he had the wings perpendicular, and they didn't account for this conical wake front. The faster they traveled, that they couldn't really break the sound barrier. Well, they almost could, but the craft wanted to fly apart, and that's the reason why all supersonic craft today have a swept wing design. The most advanced ones will actually, they could take the wings and, of course, sweep them out either perpendicular or sweep them back for going supersonic. You know, for attack vectors on some of these super advanced fighter aircraft that have actually movable wings. Regarding gravity, and of course these craft, instead of say gravity well, of course we've used that in gravity well in science and science fiction, it's better to say an actual force sink. Regarding back to time, before I get to gravity here, you can't set foot, of course, in the same waters twice. I mean, nobody on this earth is like, well, I'm going to go back in time. Well, it's completely impossible. We are, of course, all time travelers, you know. But what is time travel if we want to alter it to our will regarding the future? Well, we have to approach a certain speed, and we'd actually rarefy time relative to, say, an identical twin. But how do you rarefy time? I mean, the faster you go, the more you're going to experience temporal flux and compression of time, but you have to be at the tip of the craft. It's kind of hard to come up with a perfect analogy for this that people could wrap their brain around. Getting on to space and atoms. Oh, like for example, I wanted to talk about this on atoms, for example. Because space is the after effect, I've said a million times, the after effect of the divergent magnetic field. In the case of atoms, like on the periodic table of elements, some of the atoms' volume, measured in picometers, is twice or more of that of the volume of the next element, which might have just one more proton, for example. The volume of lithium, even though it's just one scotch right above helium, is way larger than that of helium. It's creating more magnetic flux. The element is more force unstable. Potassium, for example, right above that of argon, but potassium is way larger than that of argon. Everything in, of course, Mother Nature is field pressure mediation. How is it that potassium, which is, you know, just immediately above that of argon, why, have you ever asked yourself the question or thought about asking a so-called science teacher? Science, I got a PhD in science. Excuse me, sir, why is it that potassium, for example, or lithium, you know, the next element above that, below it, is way, way larger? Like lithium is way larger than helium, potassium is way, way larger. And they will say, so, well, those are noble gases. No, that's not an answer to my question. You know, the atomic element weight is just one tick above the one prior to it. So why is it so much larger? The simple answer, and of course everything is simplex pressure mediation, it is creating more force. Space is the after effect of a divergent magnetic field. The reason why potassium and lithium, for example, and there's countless examples in the periodic table, is so much larger is it's creating more space. And the reason why it's creating more space is because it is more magnetically unstable. The element is more magnetically unstable. It's actually creating more magnetism. This, of course, would be the volume of the torus. We have to think in terms of field propulsion craft and actually rarefaction and compression. We actually have rarefied magnetic field on that pyramidal magnet, and we actually have compression right at the tip. No different than a fireman's nozzle. If we actually take the fireman's nozzle and the pyramidal magnet in relationship to time, why is it then, therefore, that if traveling at super fantastical speeds, why is it these living beings have to live at the utmost portion of the craft? Many of these craft are saucer-shaped. Once again, they don't have to be saucer-shaped. The reason for that is so they experience the least amount of flux of time. No different than magnetic flux, no different than water pressure flux, no different than trying to break the sound barrier on these craft, which can't really do it. They can if they're built super, super great, but they want to fly apart. You know, you can't build them with the wings sticking out far left and far right, perpendicular to the vector of travel. Once they try to do that, the wake front does this number, and then it impacts the wings. These experts in aerodynamics, they finally figured that out by using wind tunnel tests and whatnot. Oh, we create a swept wing design. Go look that up. There's plenty of videos out there about swept wing designs and breaking the sound barrier. We create a swept wing design, and we can actually easily break the sound barrier. We just can't have these long perpendicular wings sticking out and breaking the sound barrier because the craft will want to fly apart, literally break apart at super high speed. Red shift and blue shift on a magnet, for example, I talked about this. You know, the south pole is blue shifted, and it's, of course, have more time and more dilation. This is the reason why the seed experiments actually work so drastically. The north, of course, is rarefied. The faster the travel, the more you actually polarize time. In creating this pyramidal magnet, I can almost reach the magnetic viewing film over there. I don't know if you could actually see it, but if you take the magnetic viewing film and put it on the side of that magnet, you'll actually see the midpoint of the plane of inertia on that pyramidal magnet is pushed way up. So the south pole, actually that's that particular one is south pole at the tip and north pole at the base. It actually doesn't matter if it's one way or the other. It just becomes more dramatic if the tip is south pole. It actually takes the plane of inertia and pushes it further up the tip. Now, if it's the North Pole, for example, you have less and less time. So if you create a North Pole tip pyramidal magnet, you actually have much less time. If you can actually, I wish I had a pyramidal magnet that was about 10 times that size. I'd pick two identical plants, one on either end, and you feed them, you give them the same food, you give them the same light and the same sunlight. The plant that's on the South Pole will actually age much quicker. You actually get better seed growth on South Pole exposed seeds, but that's starting them off. You get them a fast kickstart. They grow faster, better, but you're actually also, too, dilating time. So you're not trying to grow the whole plant underneath the South Pole, but if you were to actually put the plant on the South Pole, I don't think you could actually magnetize a neodymium iron boron about 10 times that size. That's the reason why they make really large neodymiums in sections. So you actually couldn't do it. You can't magnetize them that deeply into the material. What you'll experience is that there's a greater time on the South Pole and the plant will die a lot faster. It'll basically prematurely age. This is the reason why these beings actually travel in the upper tip of the vector of travel, because time is polarized time. This is all simplex field pressure mediation. Nobody talks about this. There's not a YouTube video or nobody talking about this. I don't even know science fiction that talks about this. I was trying to use, the diagram of the deep water versus the shallow water. I thought that would be the best. For the deep water, you have greater exposure to temporal pressure. You're traveling through at the same flux, but the person up here experiences a whole lot less pressure than someone traveling down here trying to reach a specific temporal destination, like a point in the future. So you actually have temporal pressure that's greater at the bottom, where there's a greater water pressure, analogously to, of course, temporal pressure. Same as the sound barrier, like I said, on the wing of aircraft swoopback design. So speed reduces time dilation, but in smaller and smaller volumes. But of course, to compensate, time is compressed in its wake. So we have to think of super fast travel no different than the early experts in aerodynamics had to understand pressure wake curvature. That's actually a specific term. Pressure wake curvature, where actually the wake curvature as you approach the speed of sound is the exact same thing that would be experienced on not the speed of light, because light's not a speed, it's the rate of induction or hysteresis of the medium. But you have to think of the same things. Like if you wanted to travel from planet A to planet B, and of course you're able to, due to zero-point energy source, whatever that may be, and of course you're chasing, by the way, these things actually chase a gravity sink. How these field propulsion craft actually travel is they chase a gravity sink. They're creating a gravity sink, like a sink, for example, in your bathrooms. Like, I'm going to go to the bathroom sink. A sink, of course, means a depression. Nobody thinks about that. They just hear sink, and nobody ever thinks about stuff. You know, it's a depression. It's a sink. You know, it's called a sink because it's a depression for water to drain into. The way these craft work is they actually focus a gravity sink. You say gravity well, but it's better to call it a sink because we all have an idea what a sink is in our heads. Focus a gravity sink at the vector of travel. It's like, you want to travel that direction? Well, you create this gravity sink using field pressure for that vector of travel. This also, too, by the way, explains, and this is completely anecdotal, I don't know if it's true or not, that these craft, while they're super elegant and infinitely fast and absolutely amazing, they are extremely unstable at low speeds, like subsonic, anything subsonic or less. These craft apparently are quite unstable, especially at any slow speeds. They appear to be very unstable, and the reason why, apparently, pure speculation, these craft have crashed is they become very unstable and unmanageable at really low speeds. They're not designed to travel like that. I mean, creeping along at, say, 30 miles an hour. So you had a field propulsion craft that wanted to cruise over someplace at 30, 40 miles an hour. They don't, because they're incredibly unstable. That's apparently the only reason why these craft actually crash. Now, that's purely speculative on my part, but it's perfectly logical relative to what the craft are and actually how they work. I've had so many people say, well, GPS satellite time dilation proves relativity. Well, it does exactly the opposite. The faster you travel, the more you're dilating time. But time is not a thing. Time is a measure. The faster you travel, the more you polarize that measure. This is no different than redshift or blue shift. Yeah. You know, how is it you change the frequency of light, you know, either shorter or longer, redshift, blue shift, by moving faster? Well, you're changing the measure, and a frequency is a measure, measured in hertz, you know, gigahertz, megahertz, terahertz. It's like, how are you actually changing the measure of any frequency? By changing its speed relative to where you are. Same way, when you're going fast, you actually dilate and rarefy time. Anyway, any of these craft that are traveling at, above, beyond the speed of light, they actually have to be at the very tip, because you actually polarize time relative to the vector of travel. It becomes rarefied as far to the front of the vector of travel that you're actually traveling, and compressed or expanded, if you will, to make things simple, at the back end. So if you wanted to arrive alive, you would actually be forced to travel in the very tip of the craft. No different than magnetic flux, like on that pyramidal magnet, no different than pressure flux on a fireman's hose. This is what time is. Time is a measure. It doesn't exist ultimately, but as existential beings composed of mass and magnitude, you know, flying through space on several different vectors, these are the necessities of understanding how we're able to travel at, near, above, beyond the speed of light. I'm saying us, any being out there, if they have field propulsion craft and they're creating a gravity sink or gravity well, take your pick, towards the vector of travel that they want to actually travel in, they're basically chasing a depression. It's like, okay, well, that's great now, but how do we keep from not arriving alive instead of a pile of dust because we've compressed time? It's like, well, you have to travel at the very, very tippy end of the craft. And all of this is hyperlogical. So we're all time travelers, but we can't go back in time. Nobody can set foot in the same waters twice. We can, however, change the flux of amount of time that we experience by changing how we actually experience time. No different than redshift and blue shift, no different than magnetic flux. I think these analogies aren't the best in the world, but they're very, very simple. I mean, field pressure mediation is simple, super simple geometry. And how would you want to arrive at the same destination? Would you want to arrive there, you know, on the surface of the water, or like 1,000 feet below the water? If they're identical twins on either the ship or the submarine, you know, one's going to undergo a lot of pressure. I used to do a lot of diving. There's a cumulative damage from diving at depth. It doesn't matter how safe you were, the pressure on your system changes. That's no different than temporal pressure on our bodies as far as them aging. This is the reason why there's such drastic results, and thousands of you have duplicated these experiments I've told you about, of magnetic seed exposure. The reason why magnetic seed, you got a polarized molecule, i.e. water, being exposed to a polarized object, i.e. the magnet, which of course is a polarized object. Faster you travel, the more you polarize time, and that of course has to be taken into effect. All of this to me is extremely simple. The next question is, how do you build the craft? Actually, the craft is not so much in question as is the nature of the unlimited free energy source that would be required to power that much of a drain of enormous megawatts of power. I mean, that's just an enormous amount of power required to do that. And the only way, because you could never take that much fuel of any type, even if it's some sort of super battery. You couldn't take a super battery or anything. It would have to be point source energy that would power such a craft. That, of course, is the answer that the big question to the answer that I don't have, nor do I forgot there's a little bit of metal. I forgot there's a little bit of metal on this chalkboard. I put it over there. It's sticking. There we go. This is a dangerous magnet. You can actually feel the tip of it because the magnetic flux is so high. You can feel it on the tip of your nose and your lips, but it actually affects your cryptochrome, so I don't like to do that, even though it's fun. You can literally feel it tingling. That is one powerful magnet. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I read every question and comment that you have. I hope you have a lovely week, and sorry I didn't make a video yesterday. You know, somebody decided to hit me in their BMW. Stuff like that happens. Thank you.